The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Navigating the Middle East, Insights with Ambassador Alina Romanowski. Presented in partnership with the Alaska World Affairs Council. The Middle East remains at the center of global attention, from shifting alliances to security challenges and ongoing regional transformations. Ambassador Alina Romanowski will discuss the forces shaping this critical region and what they mean for U.S. engagement, diplomacy, and stability. Ambassador Romanowski is a career diplomat who served as U.S. ambassador between 2020 and 2024 to Kuwait and then Iraq.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the World Affairs Council of Juneau and to get to know some of your board members over the past few days. And the snowstorm certainly was a special treat and reminded me of my hometown of Chicago, so thanks for ordering that up. So today I'd like to focus my remarks on how the Middle East is changing and what these developments and the new Trump national security strategy portend about the future role of the United States in shaping a region where the United States has prioritized its engagement and resources for most of my 40-plus years in national security. Events of October 7th, 2023 and the ensuing regional conflict have reshaped the region in unexpected and dramatic ways. And the recent release of the new national security strategy by the Trump administration gives us a roadmap for how this administration will shape, and frankly already has shaped, U.S. policy in the region. So on December 4th, the White House released the 2025 National Security Strategy, which really serves each administration's highest level articulation of national security policy. So we can expect this one to guide U.S. national security and defense policies, priorities, and programs through the remainder of the second Trump administration. The last, NSS as we call it, was released by the Biden administration in 2022, and the first Trump administration released its NSS in 2017. And both are worth a read for those of you who want to really do a complete comparison. But let me highlight a few striking changes in the new NSS. So broadly speaking, it marks the most significant shift in U.S. foreign policy and tone since the beginning of the Cold War, away from long-held bipartisan consensus about America's responsibility to lead and orchestrate a rules-based international order, and toward a more realist, neo-mercantilist, and limited approach to international affairs. The new NSS lays out a novel, more constrained, limited approach to international affairs. And the new NSS places business and commerce at the center of American national security priorities. The new NSS states, and I'll quote, "The economic security is fundamental to national security." So while this concept has become widely discussed in Washington in recent years, this is really the first time that it's been featured as a central component in an NSS. The strategy emphasizes four of the most vital and important areas to the United States. That's critical manufacturing, defense industrial base, energy, and financial services. And the NSS also prioritizes trade rebalancing and supply chain security. And commercial diplomacy is prioritized, and the role of American companies is emphasized. At the same time, much language in this NSS reflects emerging bipartisan consensus that breaks from decades of foreign policy tradition, including a recognition that the U.S. goals in the world stage need to be recalibrated substantially to match the limits of our own capabilities. This emerging view also focuses on domestic revitalization as a prerequisite for effective global projection. So since the release of the first Trump administration's 2017 NSS, the great power competition has been the defining characteristic of the international system as viewed by American policymakers. Both the 2017 Trump NSS and the 2022 Biden NSS emphasized the road to counter China and Russia in their efforts to unseat American dominance in the world global system. The 2025 NSS, in contrast, adopts something closer to what we call a spheres of influence view of the world order, where the United States holds domination in the Western Hemisphere first and protects narrowly defined core national interests in other regions. And the strategy notes, and again I quote, "As the United States rejects the ill-fated concept of global domination for itself, we must prevent the global, and in some cases even regional, domination of others." The organizing framework of the U.S. adversaries, which is China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, is hardly mentioned in the new strategy. Instead, China is viewed as a peer to be managed, and Washington can pursue a genuinely mutually advantageous economic relationship with Beijing while maintaining a robust and ongoing focus on deterrence to prevent war in the Indo-Pacific. Russia is framed as a chief antagonist to Europe, whereby the United States plays the role of broker, leading, as the NSS states, and I quote again, "diplomatic engagement both to reestablish conditions of strategic stability across the Eurasian landmass and to mitigate the risks of conflict between Russia and European states." Iran is portrayed as greatly weakened, and North Korea isn't even mentioned. And the relaxation of the great powers competition construct opens the possibility to greater U.S. collaboration, especially in non-sensitive commercial sectors with China, and maybe perhaps even Russia in the coming years. And that said, though, threats from adversaries, as we call them, often not named in the NSS, but still assumed to be the four that I just mentioned, which are core to our national interests, especially commercial and economic interests, will continue to be the focus of national security policy. So let me turn to how this has an impact on the Middle East. While there are specific regional sections broken out in the new NSS, my region of experience is what I really want to talk about. And the NSS argues clearly that the days are long gone where the Middle East region, dominated by U.S. foreign policy, is not there because the region is no longer matters to the United States, but because in this administration's view, the Middle East is no longer a constant irritant or the region of imminent catastrophe as it once was. Indeed, the region has changed significantly after October 7th. Israel's leadership is different. Syria's leadership is completely different. It's now under a reformed terrorist trying to rebuild a country torn apart by a brutal dictator, a 10-year civil war, and ISIS. Palestinian leadership is not much different, and that needs to change. Iran and its proxies in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen are mostly dismantled. Iraq, where Iran-backed militias remain outside the control of government, is slowly crawling out of 23 years of conflict and is in an existential tug-of-war between the United States and Iran. Gaza remains in a fragile ceasefire and a horrific humanitarian crisis, and in an ephemeral search for peace and rebuilding. We saw on September 9th an Israeli attack on Hamas in Qatar, which threatened the fragile Gaza ceasefire and a return to Israeli military freelancing. And this fall, we've seen parliamentary elections in Iraq with a government that's now in a caretaker status, the first visit of a Syrian president to the Oval Office since Syrian independence in 1946, and the first visit to Washington since 2010 of the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, with some $1 trillion in pledged investment in the United States. So it's changed a lot since October 2023. The Trump administration's first principles for the region over the past year, and I would say even during his first administration, have been to take bold action and be deeply transactional, declaring no more forever wars, no more nation building, pushing to expand the Abraham Accords, and prioritizing commercial diplomacy. Notwithstanding the assertions in the new NSS, the administration is still all in on American engagement, but wants out of the business of guaranteeing security in the region or propping up countries with large assistance programs that are not considered national security priorities. So rather, this Trump strategy sees the region emerging as a place of partnership, friendship, and investment, but on a two-way street. In his bold actions, the president has looked for unconventional decisions that previous administrations have deigned to consider to jolt the region into different outcomes. For example, Trump quickly decided to deal with the new interim Syrian president, Ahmed al-Shara, if Shara fully shed his terrorist credentials and joined the international coalition fight against ISIS, inviting him to the Oval Office in November to cement that deal. President Trump also successfully pressured Hamas and pressed Israel into signing the October ceasefire by using his leverage as one of the most popular politicians in Israel and his solid personal relations with those Arab leaders with contacts in Hamas. And most importantly, Trump broke Washington's longstanding unwritten rule against engaging directly with Hamas, which really helped him to secure the ceasefire at the end of the day. I think President Trump's boldest move so far has been the June 2025 strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. And for many decades, many policymakers and pundits insisted that attacking Tehran's nuclear program would provoke a regional war. As a result, American administrations not only forswore U.S. attacks on Iran, they also blocked Israeli ones. But Trump gave the Israelis the green light and then jumped in. About a week ago, I returned from the Doha Forum in Qatar, which is where they assemble a lot of think tankers and representatives of various administrations. But it was abundantly clear to me, both in conversations with my colleagues and what was being said, that despite continued Israeli attacks in Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and even on Qatar, those countries that have been traditionally more aligned with us are even more aligned than before and are willing to take on a leading role in mediating the existing conflicts. And this is a result, again, of the president and his administration pressing hard for them to take a more active role. And despite the messages from the administration about U.S. shifting the nature of our engagement in the region, most Middle East actors and leaders still want and need the U.S. to be a guarantor of the region's security, stability, as well as a major source of investments in advanced technology to create innovation and economic growth for the next generation and to reduce their own dependence on fossil fuels. Both they and the leadership and their citizens, especially the youth, are really tired of conflicts. They want to move on. They're focused on securing jobs, largely by connecting with the global economy and the innovation community. So under President Trump, the Gulf states have become the fulcrum of the new regional order and a clear key block for navigating the region out of the most recent conflict. President Trump's first trip abroad was to Saudi Arabia, if you recall, and in the first early months of the administration, the Qatari and Emiri heads of state made early visits to Washington. The recent visit of Saudi Crown Prince marked really the final step in Washington's efforts to reset the U.S. ties with the Gulf after some tough years under both the Trump and the Biden administrations. I would say that over the past 5 years, the U.S. and our Gulf partners have sharply disagreed more than we've agreed on regional issues. And I want to just reference the rift with Qatar, for example, the Khashoggi assassination, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the lackluster responses to Iranian and Yemeni belligerent attacks, normalization with Israel, and hedging dangerous partnerships with Russia and China, just to name some of the few issues where we had significant disagreements, not always in public, but certainly in private. So in keeping with his deeply transactional nature, Trump supports Saudi Arabia and other Gulf sheikdoms because they are a source of capital, an export market for semiconductors and weapons, and an important aspect of the global energy markets and certainly critical minerals that are important to us. He can and he wants to do business with them, get them to invest in the United States, and get Americans to reciprocate. The Israeli attack on Qatar on September 9th, however, has been really a catalyst for the president to reaffirm the importance of the Gulf to the United States and regional security. The Trump administration has recognized that deterrence in the Gulf can no longer rest solely on U.S. military presence, arms sales, and economic deals. It requires a much more integrated and politically viable framework. So going forward, Washington is pushing the Gulf states and others to take more responsibility in resolving their own internal disputes, countering terrorism that still exists, and investing in their own economic advancement, but really on his own terms and what's best for America. So what can happen going forward despite this new strategy? I want to talk a little bit about the key spoilers that are lurking in the region. These spoilers and these issues really could derail the Trump administration's strategy in the region and have been really contentious and difficult issues for many previous administrations. So let me just say that Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen, and the Palestinian-Israeli situation are the principal spoilers and sources of tension and official and difficult unresolved issues that really could reignite the armed conflict in the region as unexpectedly as it has before. But here, too, Trump will need to take an unconventional action to calm the region and manage these key spoilers. So let me talk about a few of them in a little bit greater detail. We can't really take away from the president's success in getting a deal to return the hostages, secure a fragile ceasefire in Gaza, and launch the 20-point plan for disarming Hamas, reconstructing Gaza, and creating a possible pathway for Palestinian statehood. But the administration will face key challenges in implementing the 20-point plan, particularly standing up the so-called International Stabilization Force, which is really a multinational, mostly Arab security initiative envisioned by the Trump's plan to keep the peace in Gaza. Trump does not back a two-state solution for the Palestinians, even though it has widespread backing within Washington's traditional foreign policy establishment. He understands that Israel does not want to cede land and should not be asked to do so. And many Arab countries, frankly, reluctantly understand this reality. Even during Israel's onslaught in Gaza and the attack on Qatar, to the shock of many, those Arab leaders who publicly signed on to, publicly or quietly supported the Abraham Accords have mostly stood by their agreements and their commitments. And even though President Trump wants to get back to revitalizing the Abraham Accords, he knows that that's going to be very difficult under this current environment. He also knows that he can't hand Israel a blank check, and he's been sensitive to the public relations concerns of key Arab leaders. He's warned the Israelis not to annex the West Bank, but he has remained silent on expansion of their settlements in the West Bank. I think realistically, peace between Israel and the Palestinians is not on the horizon, but the Trump administration believes certainly that sustaining a calmer region will give the United States time to work on difficult issues in other priority regions. But again, both Hamas and Israel are still inclined to pressure each other militarily when it's convenient, and the 20-point plan is likely to be too difficult to implement for many reasons, and it's going to remain dormant. This is going to leave the Israeli Defense Forces to continue to assume the security responsibilities, patrol the demilitarized zones, and occasionally bomb emerging threats from Hamas, leaving Gaza as a festering wound and ultimately requiring the president's constant vigilance in keeping Prime Minister Netanyahu restrained. Let me turn to another spoiler. The Iranian nuclear challenge, meanwhile, is still very much unfinished business. Despite his protestations to the opposite, President Trump is still facing the fact that the Iranian nuclear program has not been completely obliterated. And there are rampant rumors already that Israel is poised to attack Iran again, with the expectation that such attacks could provoke regime change and finish off what has started in the nuclear file. Iran's clerical and military leadership are shaken, and they're still sorting out how their defenses were compromised and their intelligence apparatus penetrated. So some still want to settle internal scores and sideline the supreme leader, who is physically frail and made some catastrophic misjudgments about Israel's power. And although the regime is going to lie low for now, it's waiting for a moment when the United States becomes distracted with other crises and also Israel loses its focus. Then I think most experts predict that Iran will resume its nuclear program with alacrity, and what Israel and the United States would be prepared to do is anyone's guess for now, and I'm not even going to speculate on that. Let's turn to Syria. Syria, under interim President Shara's leadership, has really a remarkable run the first year since the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad. Syria could very easily have become a highly unstable country, but it is much more stable, frankly, than anybody predicted. Shara, I think, with the support of Gulf leaders and the decisive U.S. action in the waning days of the Biden administration, was successful in quickly building trust with countries in the region and getting also President Trump to lift Shara's terrorist designation and agree to remove fully the Caesar Act sanctions, which is in the bill right now. But Shara really has a long way to go to get his arms around internal governance and vigilante violence, as well as combating the remnants of ISIS that are in ungoverned spaces in Syria. He also has to fully incorporate the Syrian Defense Forces into the Syrian security apparatus if he's going to have any stability. So he has a lot to do. And rebuilding Syria is not going to happen quickly, and Shara will need the involvement of the United States, both diplomatically, economically, and militarily, and also really as a catalyst for bringing Syria's immediate neighbors, the Gulf states and Europe, to invest in rebuilding his country. Let me turn to Iraq. Iraq, too, remains unfinished business for Washington, despite some good progress in relations over the past few years. While Iraq is much different from the Iraq of 2003, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, or of 2014, with the outbreak of ISIS, or even 2017, when ISIS was declared to be defeated and not so much, but the U.S.-Iraqi relations really do struggle to move beyond conflict and security issues. So as part of checking Iranian influence in the wider region, President Trump is adamant about clipping Iran's tentacles in Iraq. And the Trump administration, following also in the Biden administration's footsteps, has doubled down on pressuring the current government, Prime Minister Soudani's government, to disarm Iran-backed militia groups and dismantle the economic networks that sustain them, in exchange for transitioning to a deeper bilateral security relationship and greater U.S. economic investments. The significant disagreement over the status of these militias and their economic arm is going to continue to be an obstacle to moving U.S.-Iraq relations beyond conflict and security issues and bring greater U.S. Western economic investment to Iraq. Last month, Iraq held a consequential parliamentary election at a time when the Prime Minister has been trying to avoid Iraq getting embroiled into the regional conflict that raged over the past few years, and they were very successful in doing so. The elections were seen as a statement of Iraq's own peaceful transition of power, and that the country is on the right democratic path. But the divisive sectarian process of forming a government that in the past has taken up to 11 months will test not only the public's confidence in Iraq's political system, but that of Iraq's international partners, and risks reversing much of the recent gains in stability and economic reforms. And one final comment on Iraq is that despite these credible elections, the credibility of Iraq's political elite to push back against Iranian influence is in serious question. It's not at all clear whether meaningful change in Iraq can come through the ballot box. While Soudani's party secured the largest number of votes, that may not be enough to give him a second term, since a lot of his political rivals favor much more of a malleable prime minister, beholden to much more to narrower Shia interests, and also more Iranian influence. So that's going to be a big question mark. But regardless of the orientation of the new government, the U.S. relationship is going to be largely determined by this tug of war between U.S. interests and Iranian influence in the region. Let me just add a final quick word on Yemen. Once it was a major source of attacks on Israel and international shipping, but a ceasefire has sort of put things in certain place. Washington's attention really now on Yemen is now mostly seen through the prism of keeping this ceasefire intact to ensure that the Iran-backed Houthis do not resume attacks on maritime shipping through the Red Sea. Again, the United States is not looking to have to deal with that issue again. And while recent efforts between the Saudis and the Emiratis, who don't always agree on who they're going to support in parts of Yemen, can create some tensions, it's not really going to derail the ceasefire, and it's also not going to get in the way of a much more important relationship, especially with us. But it could contribute to low-level tension. So let me just wrap up in conclusion after having walked through what I consider to be some of the biggest spoilers that are on the horizon. But if these spoilers don't create chaos or return the region to conflict, I think the Trump administration is in the strongest position to reassess our military and economic posture in the Middle East, which is, I think, reflected in how they drafted the section on the Middle East. But again, the outlining the spoilers shows that, that we're not out of the woods there, both because there is conflict, but also the regional leaders themselves expect the United States to continue to play a significant role. But I think with the dwindling need for large-scale deployments, Washington can once again embrace strategic power projection in that region by relying on rapid response capabilities and forward basing. We still have a significant presence in that region, as well as expanding military interoperability and integration among the regional partners, which has been a part of our efforts for as long as I've been working on it, to try to get the region to be more integrated on, especially with those who have the resources to do so. What also is significant is that the Trump executive order pledging to defend Qatar after the attacks on the Israeli attacks on September 9th has sent really an explicit a message that the United States red lines now in the region exist beyond Israel. And with the president dangling security commitments like the F-35 sale and a possible defense pact, the Gulf states and others have reason to assume that Trump is serious about building a foundation for a new security architecture in the region, provided that, again, the United States offers the necessary backing to make it credible. Let me talk a little bit on expanding economic investments. The president also has been hammering home the message that security is not just a matter of defense and military ties, but also economic ones, with greatly increasing commercial and investment ties with the United States. Our largest Gulf partners, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, have begun shifting their own economies to be less reliant on oil revenues, moving beyond oil production to alternative energy, innovation, and most recently, becoming a home for the latest in AI technology. During the visit of Mohammed bin Salman in Washington, the Saudis actually hosted a very large investment summit to explore those investment horizons across these critical sectors that the president had outlined: energy, technology, financial services, infrastructure, and even healthcare for that matter. So at this point, when we look to the future, in today's competitive global ecosystem, I think winning means supply chain security, cutting-edge technology innovation, industrial capacity, and agile economies. So for the United States and certainly our key Gulf partners, to all win on this global arena, we're going to need each other as trusted allies and business partners. And with the president's transactional approach to resolving issues and his commitment not to spend enormous resources for nation building, I think the United States could get a better deal on getting stability in the region and certainly more economic benefits that would return to us. It's very much going to be, we'll have to see whether or not all of those spoilers, as I briefly outlined, are going to be able to be managed at the same time that this administration is going to want to readjust and pull back slightly. So I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of how we see what's going on in the region, and we'll see what happens in a region that I think has always surprised us in some very interesting ways. So thanks very much, and I look very much forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that overview. A series of questions, and I'll take them one at a time. There's been a lot of recent reporting of the imminent loss of water in Tehran. What's your assessment of its effect on Iran's foreign policy and its leadership in fomenting disruption in the Middle East? Do you see that as a restraining factor?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the whole region is suffering a huge water shortage. And so if you look at the geography and how water sort of flows, you'll see that one of the things that the Iranians have done is to basically try to minimize the amount of water that flows into Iraq and flows south. The Iraq, for example, also has suffered greatly from a shortage of water, and they look to negotiating better water flows from the Iranians, from the Turks, and even from the Syrians. And that's created a lot of tension. Then you look at the water problem that's in Egypt. You look at the water problem that's also in Lebanon, in Syria, and even flowing into Israel. And we have been looking at that problem for many, many decades, and in some ways almost waiting for a conflict to erupt in the region because of that. The fact that there's been significant drought in the region over the last couple of years, and again, this manipulation and cutoff of water, or the regulating water that is focused more on domestic rather than upholding agreements that these countries have had, has really created a huge amount of tension. So that is also another area where you never know when that's going to happen, especially if you know, the drought extends and you know, citizens there can't you know, irrigate their crops, and there are all sorts of issues related to the water one. So yeah, it is one that is looming, and it seems like, you know, every couple of years we manage to sort of skate a major disaster. But yeah, the Iranians are definitely, but the Turks are too, and the Syrians are too, calibrating the water.
Not seeing anyone behind me yet. I hope that's a prompt. The second, if President Trump were to ask you for your advice, what would you advise him to be counseling Netanyahu in terms of the settler outbreaks, for lack of a better term, in the West Bank? Do you see the possibility of yet another intifada that parallels the kinds of disruptions that we've seen in Gaza itself?
Well, that has always been a concern, having another outbreak of violence, of extensive violence in the West Bank. My counsel to the president would be simply to continue to engage with Prime Minister Netanyahu and his leadership, that the last thing Israel needs is more violence and an outbreak in the West Bank, and that, you know, settlements are just one of a major issue that could spark more violence, and that at the moment it is much more important to focus on ensuring the ceasefire in Gaza holds, ensuring that humanitarian assistance can be delivered to Gazans, and to make sure that aspects of the 20-point plan, which ultimately could lead to a pathway for some kind of a statehood for the Palestinians, gets on track. But that's a really tall order to convince Mr. Netanyahu to move forward on that.
Thanks for a very, very good presentation. It was very, very thorough. What, in your opinion, will it take to revitalize the PLO as an active political player in the situation, or is that time past? I almost missed Yasser Arafat.
Well, I would say that resurrecting or reconstituting the PLO, as we all remember it, is probably not the best approach in order to find a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. What I think both Palestinians and Israelis are struggling with is going forward with a younger generation of leadership to see whether or not they can forge some kind of pathway to peace. And I think that's, every administration I've worked for in my career have tried all sorts of different approaches. Hasn't worked. It's very complicated. And at the end of the day, the U.S. continues and will continue to play an important role in trying to both mitigate any conflict, but also bring the two sides together if we can. And I think that's just something the United States is just going to stay engaged in, and to varying degrees of success, until both the Israelis and the Palestinians want to sit down and really solve this problem. Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. My name is Phil Lawler. Two topics I'd ask you to elaborate on, and I guess the first I'll start with. Bruce asked about the possibility of another intifada, and Jim asked about like the Palestinian unity. But in the Iraqi side, and I know you know Iraq, I'm curious about what you see as projected or the trajectory for Iraqi unity between the Shias and the Sunnis and the Kurds, I think. Are you optimistic for maintaining a unified nation?
I'm optimistic that the Sunnis, the Kurds, and the Shia will find a way forward to form a government. But it's not easy, and there's a lot of backroom deals that occur that take place. I am optimistic only because I tend to be after many years. And at the end of the day, I do believe that they will find a way to compromise on candidates, to have their key interests accommodated under the system that they have, which is at least informally and traditionally the presidency has been reserved for the Kurds. The prime minister is Shia, and the speaker of the parliament is Sunni. The question is, how long is that going to take? And the longer it takes, the more outside forces can get in and advance their own interests and not the interest of Iraq. When I left Iraq essentially at the end of last year, this month, it was very clear that many Iraqis were very tired of the outside influence in manipulating their politics. And I think many of them were looking forward to this election as a way to sort of right-size all of that. But I am confident that they'll find a way to form a government. It may not be their best government. It may not be a government that is going to be have a straight line to kind of provide the services and continue to attract economic investment in Iraq and ensure that what Prime Minister Soudani has been doing to curb corruption is going to take place. But again, the formation of this government is much more in the hands of these three large political groups now than, frankly, they ever were before. And that's a good thing for Iraq, as bumpy and as difficult as it may be for them. But they know and they understand that Iraq plays an important role in the region, and that for Iraq to have the kind of stability and the investment by the international community, they have to sort out their sectarian issues and form a government. So we'll wait and see. It's early. They're supposed to get together and discuss this in the first Parliament of the new year, and we'll see what happens on that. I'm going to stay optimistic.
Good. Thank you. If I may, then one other topic I'd ask you to maybe offer some thoughts on, in a sort of a broader sense. And Bruce, they asked about the PLO or an intifada, but in a broader sense, going back maybe a century, in this movements that manifested as violent or radical Islamist movements that more recently were Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm curious what you see as sort of the long-term projection for those things. If you see this as sort of, a post-colonial movement and still a lot of the same grievances or issues potentially driving it. It feels like in the States, like this is tamped down since, a decade or two ago, but with little things popping up. But do you see that as a long-term trajectory, or is that just a temporary suppression?
I think it's certainly for the medium term because of essentially the Israeli actions after October, where they, what the Israelis did to dismantle Hezbollah, what we have done with the international coalition to defeat ISIS in Iraq. We have the Iraqis much more involved in their own efforts to go after remaining ISIS pockets in Iraq. You have Syrians and this is very important for President Shara and President Trump to come to an understanding that Syria would now play and join the international coalition and go after ISIS. Just last week, there was an attack on American soldiers in Syria as they were going after ISIS. So I think we still, at least in that region, I think we're still going to be able to manage ISIS leaders that come up, but it's going to take a lot for these terrorist groups to completely be wiped out, largely because the grievances still remain, and the grievances in the region are an organizing principle around which these terrorist groups can continue to attract supporters. But it is much more, it is much less than it was before, but not out. They're not down and out.
As others have said, thank you for a really clear explanation of what's going on in that area at the moment and U.S. policy. I was thinking about two particular groups and what roles they have. I think you've already answered the one about the Kurds, and the other ones the other country that's been pro-Western, moderate, and more tolerant has been Jordan. So does Jordan still have a role to play in moderating things throughout that area? No,
I think Jordan has and has always looked to by its own neighbors, including Israel, and by us as a moderating role in the region, but a precarious one at that too, because it's sort of sandwiched in between all of these the forces. But and this is why the relationship between the United States and Jordan has been so close over the 40, 50 years. We haven't always agreed on how to implement some of the changes and reforms, and the Jordanians do need to do a lot of economic reform, but our assistance to Jordan is one of the few places where this administration is continuing its large assistance, because I think in recognition of the role that the Jordanians play in trying to keep the region, especially their corner of the region, in a stable place. And the same thing, and I think the Jordanians have very good relations with the Gulf, and we worked very closely with them on some Iraqi issues, and they for them working with this interim president in Syria is going to be very important to, again, Syria to rebuild Syria over time.
Thanks, ma'am. Phil Lawler again, just to follow up, and I think you gave me an idea to follow up. But so going back to this sort of the radical or violent Islamist groups, and as you mentioned, as you described, I think it sounds like, organizationally, the organization's been beaten down, leaders whacked, and the organization dismantled. But as you said, like grievances are like the core reasons behind them maybe are not really resolved yet. But you mentioned Jordan are moderating sort of leaders to help sort of lead that movement, and you mentioned Jordan, but I think maybe 20 years ago-ish, there was some hope that Turkey might stand up to lead sort of like the Islamic world as a moderate face and Western leaning, and kind of as an economic success story, kind of either lead or set an example for that. What do you see for the prospects for that now?
Well, I think, Turkey is playing both important role in working through these difficult issues, but also can be often a catalyst of their own interests. So I would say, for example, the Iraqi-Turkish relationship has become, I think, more constructive in the last couple of years towards trying to solve problems on the border in Syria and also in Iraqi Kurdistan. The water issue is one where I think the Turks definitely have understood that it's important to provide the amount of water that the Iraqis need. The Turks play a really key role in what's going to be happening in Syria, and it's in their own interest, frankly, to play a constructive role. There are still challenges, again, with ISIS, with the Syrian Democratic Forces that have been our partner in maintaining ISIS, in controlling ISIS in Syria and, frankly, in Iraq. So, Turkey looks to both East and West, but it's a very important country. President Trump appointed our ambassador to Turkey as the envoy to Syria. Again, I think in large measure as a recognition, maybe not just because maybe he's a good negotiator, but more importantly because Turkey and our relationship with Turkey is very important in how we're going to work on the recovery and rebuilding of Syria. Not to mention ISIS and Iranian influences in the region.
This is a little off the mark, but given your experience in our foreign policy infrastructure, looking over your 40-plus years, how one can reconcile today's policy that on the one hand will condemn the Taliban in Afghanistan, but also terminate temporary protected status for 300,000 Afghans, or in the case of Venezuela, which we've declared a narco state and maybe on the verge of some sort of armed conflict, and at the same time terminate the temporary protected status for, again, several 100,000 Venezuelans. It's difficult for me to conceive this happening in other administrations, but it also reflects perhaps some conflict between state and homeland security, for example. How do those issues normally get resolved?
Well, I would say that changing the protected status of Afghans who supported us in the war, and others that step up, and we have been able to bring into the conflict and bring around the end of conflict in the region is a very important statement of our own credibility in those situations. And I think that it will make it, should we ever have to go back in the way we have both in Afghanistan and in other places, in Yemen, for example, and even in Iraq, it's going to be much more difficult to attract the kind of support that we would need in trying to respond militarily with boots on the ground, if that's the decision by any president for that matter. And there's a lot of discussion about whether or not there was proper vetting, whether or not we have taken too much time. There was a lot of criticism in previous administrations about not processing people fast enough. But that's in some ways because the vetting process takes a long time. But nevertheless, once we've offered this protected status to people when we needed their help, I don't think it's going to be a good decision and put us in a good situation in the future, regardless of whether it's the Middle East or any other region, if we don't at least follow through. There's a lot of details in that which I won't go into, but I do think that that was not I don't think that's going to be helpful to our credibility in any region.
This should be the last question.
Just focusing back a little closer to the Middle East, given that the U.S. now is engaging with various countries and partners in the Middle East, the fact that the conflict in Sudan is essentially kept alive by the backing of different Middle East folks. What do you think the prospects are for us to be able to influence them to bring some peace there?
Yeah. Well, I think definitely, we've tried our hand at bringing peace to Sudan. Our partners in the Middle East, for that matter, are trying, and not always in agreement with how we would necessarily do it. But it does give us an opportunity to work with them because, again, if the Trump administration doesn't want to return to engaging in these conflicts, then we need to work with our partners who are willing to do that. And we do have a view, and we do want to bring peace to, or at least end the conflict in Sudan. So I do think that we'll have to have those difficult conversations with our partners. And I believe that was something that was raised in when the Saudi Crown Prince visited Washington a couple of weeks ago. Thank you. Thanks very much.
That was Ambassador Alina Romanowski in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with KTOO. It was recorded December 16th, 2025 at KTOO in Juneau. JWAC presentations are supported by seasoned sponsors, Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wassman & Associates, Ramada Inn, and Jim Clark.